Black people have a rich history in the Americas and Caribbean, and were foundational in developing modern societies. With our roots in Africa, today's Afro-Latinos can be from any country in Latin America. It all started in 1492 when Christopher Columbus and other European explorers decided to sail the ocean blue. In Latin America, the French colonized what is today Haiti, the Portuguese colonized Brazil, and the Spanish took over most of the other territories.
So Black people in Latin America and the Caribbean have always been in the region, in the colonies and in the nations, as workers and as cultural producers and as intellectuals.
The exact number of slaves is unknown, but experts think about 12.5 million Africans were forcibly displaced by the transatlantic slave trade. Historians estimate around 10.7 million survived the journey, known as the Middle Passage. Shipping records show fewer than 400,000 slaves were brought to what is today the United States. Two professors, one in the U.S. and one in England, compiled these records into what they call the Transatlantic Slave Database. The numbers are estimates. Record keeping during these times wasn't as reliable as it can be today. But people who study the slave trade consider this database the gold standard. The records show most slaves came from countries that today line the west coast of Africa.
More than half of all the slaves or enslaved persons who were brought to the New World from the African continent were actually brought to Brazil, Spanish America, and the Caribbean. In the 19th century, most, but not all, Spanish colonies in Latin America and the Caribbean became independent nations, right? So Latin American independence movements, revolutionary movements, were not led by one individual, but rather were in the majority Black and brown people.
Upon independence, these nations included freedom and equality for all in their constitutions. These were the goals, social equality and inclusiveness, but people of color were excluded. Latin America was, and still is, a multiracial society. Based on the 2010 census, around 91 million Brazilians have African ancestry. By some estimates, more than half of Brazil's population is preto, black, or pardo, mixed. Despite this, the region still struggles with systemic racism. Even after the horror of Nazi genocides, toxic strains of so-called scientific racism persist. Many people still see diversity as a threat.
One of the arguments of scientific racism is that multiracial heritage is a detriment. It's backwards. And so nations in the North Atlantic try to promote modernity via their whiteness, okay? But Latin American intellectuals, national leaders, after the war, and a little bit before, began to craft a national myth of mestizaje, of racial democracy, of racial harmony, and of brownness. And they make the argument that the racial mixture of Latin American populations is a great plus, not a negative. So, and that looks different per country. But in Brazil, you have the example of a new national myth of racial democracy. Brazil may have Black people, brown people, and some Portuguese and others, but they have a biological racial mixture, a cultural racial mixture, and therefore, the nation that is Brazil is strong and beautiful because of its racial mixture. So we don't want to separate, however, the Black people and the white people, okay? In Mexico, it's different. They promote more of an indigenous and white mix, mestizaje, okay? In Puerto Rico, you have the myth of racial harmony. We may not all be racially mixed, but we're fabulous. We love each other. We don't discriminate. In Cuba, you have a different history where it's not necessarily about biological mixture, but it is about national collaboration and imagining equality between Blacks and whites, okay? In the Dominican Republic, once Trujillo was in power and Balaguer and others took over, they created a myth where they pulled on their indigenous past and history, and they demonized the idea of blackness. That was something that belonged on the other end of the island of Hispaniola. Haitians were black, but we Dominicans are of indigenous descent, Catholic, Spanish-speaking, and kind of brown. There's an argument about muletaje, right? We're brown and proud. So we come from countries in Latin America that were very positive and affirmative in affirming racial mixture of some kind, okay? That's called a national myth, and it varies by country, okay? But you have that national myth, but then you have the reality of everyday practices of government discrimination for education, housing, healthcare, and employment. And that discrimination is very much based on race, not only on class, but on race.
Professor Del Moral points out that racial discrimination and social hierarchies are the norm in many countries that have brown, black, and white populations. And the experiences of people of color in the U.S. show this country is no different.
But we know that as Latinos in the U.S., many Latinos have been in the U.S. for over 100 years, right? Mexicans have been in the U.S. since before this was the U.S., right? In the Southwest Territory. Puerto Ricans and Cubans have come to the U.S. since the late 19th century. You know, they were radical political revolutionaries and pro-independence, and they were black. And those numbers of Cubans and Dominicans grew in the 1940s and 50s. Dominicans and Central Americans, those numbers began to grow after U.S. intervention in the Dominican Republic in the 1960s and 1970s. Central Americans continued to come in the 1980s and to the 1990s. So while we have this kind of a simple term called Latino in the US, or Latinx, to be gender inclusive, it includes all these different national groups who came to the US over different generations, including very recent ones, okay? All these people that have come to the US come from different countries that have their own understanding of racial formation and racial identity, racial inclusion or racial exclusion, right? So we Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Colombians who are black in the US are not in any way independent from that racial identity in the country of origin. And if we're not born there, our parents made sure that we understood that Dominican meant this, that Puerto Rican meant that, because they were informed by that national myth.
And this is how activists and others in the community created the term Afro-Latina.
Latinidad in the US seems to reiterate this myth of racial harmony in Latin American countries and of mestizaje or brownness, but really light-skinned brownness as the goal. But my own personal experience in the US, not me, but Afro-Latinx are saying, and I agree, is that I'm treated like a black person first before I'm treated like a brown person, outside of my community. But even inside of my community, within my Puerto Rican community, within my Dominican community, I'm also reminded of my color and my African heritages in ways that are never positive. So Black Afro-Latinx people are hyper aware of their blackness, whether inside their community, outside their community, in the US. And so there's an affirmation rather than a denial of blackness in their own experience. And the term Afro-Latinx is meant to support that.